friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm here today to wrap up everything I read in July. I'm filming this 2 days early. I think I might finish one more book, but hey ho, I'll just put it in next month's wrap up. It's not a big deal. July I read 9 books, but honestly it was a bit of a, not dud, I think like I was really unwell, so I was reading with like, you know, 10% brain quality going on, and I listened to a lot of audiobooks. And yeah, I don't know, I just wasn't finding many that hit. And then when I was starting to feel a lot better, I read one amazing book, which I think is just testament to like, maybe some of these books aren't even that bad. It was more just so I wasn't really well enough to be reading. And so I wasn't necessarily picking things that I was like super excited about. Because I don't know if you guys get this, but sometimes when I'm unwell, like physically or mentally, or like if I want to be reading, I won't pick like my most anticipated or favorite books, because I like know I want to save them for when I know I can like love them the most. And I think I wasn't feeling like able to do that this month, so I didn't pick a lot of them. I also was limited because I wasn't able to read my own physical books until the very end of the month, so I was limited to what was on my Kobo or what I could find on audio. But I started out the month by listening to The Midnight Feast by Lucy Foley. This is my first Lucy Foley book, I think, I'm pretty sure. And she's quite a cookie cutter, like slightly more literary in the spectrum of like thriller mysteries, I would say, than sort of some of the, you know, airport paperbacks that you see. But her books are quite formulaic. My mum reads a lot of her, or has read like everything she's put out. I think they're quite fun and a little like romp, I guess, but they do fall into, I feel like, a lot of pitfalls and tropes. So The Midnight Feast is set at a exclusive hotel in Dorset, set up by a very well-off middle-class woman who's inherited this like huge country house from her family, and she wants to create like a wellness retreat type hotel setup. But the manor and the locals are very unhappy with that fact. She's sort of like trespassing on land. She wants to privatise a lot of the land around the hotel and prevent it from being public walkways. And privatising of like countryside in the UK is definitely like a big topic of conversation in like geography spaces, and also just like in wider social justice ideas that we should all have access to nature. So Foley does pull on those ideas, I think, in quite an interesting way that makes me feel like it is a little step above perhaps some of the more basic thriller, because she does include those socioeconomic questions. But it basically follows 5 characters: the founder, the lover, the mystery guest, the kitchen help, and the detective. And they're all sort of intertwined as we are leading up to the welcome event, this big midnight feast that's going to happen on the weekend. I think it's on the solstice, to welcome a lot of like press and different friends and important people, I guess, to the area. And then obviously things go awry, someone's found dead, and we go from there. It's not necessarily sort of, it's not a closed circle isolated type setup, because there is interactions, like I say, between the manor and the outside world, I guess, like the local area. And we have characters that fall in one camp or fall in both camps, and it tries to, I guess, pit against one another this idea of like local native and intruding gentrifier, I guess, is the setup when it comes to class politics. The audiobook was really well narrated, I will say that. It was very well done, like notable character differences, and with some music, and like it did feel atmospheric in places, I guess. It felt a little bit lightweight, I guess, in the way it dealt with some of those big questions, which, like, I guess you shouldn't expect it to be conquering those questions of land rights and gentrification so wholeheartedly when it is set up as a mystery thriller. I don't know if I'll read any of her other stuff. I know she has, is it 3 other ones? Because I think my mum basically said that they all kind of follow the same formula and structure of like an event or like a setup, a setting. The Paris apartment is set in Paris, and the hunting lodge is set in a Scottish hunting lodge, and then a group of like middle class people, and then things transpire from there. So I think if I was to read another, I would definitely take quite a big break, because I get really frustrated when I feel like I'm reading the same mystery over and over again. Because that's like, I go to a mystery book to like feel intrigued, not necessarily comforted by a repetition of the story like I do in other genres. So I'm not sure. Would love to know your thoughts about The Midnight Feast if you've listened to it. I know it just came out. I actually listened to it on BookBeat, which is a new audio book app I'm trying, and it has a lot of really new releases on it. I actually have an affiliate code that I put in my box down below. This is not an ad or anything. I just started trying it because my friend was using it, and I found some really good stuff on there, so that's how I listened to that. Okay, next up I read Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. This is a literary thriller suspense. I wouldn't actually think it's I didn't find it that literary, I guess. It's a thriller suspense novel based on true events. I listened to this on audio, and I will say off the bat again, the audio narration was really great. It really felt in keeping with the dual timeline, so it's set in between the 1970s and close-ish to present day, I think, or in the mid to 2010s. And it follows, it's a fictionalized account, I think, of the Ted Bundy murders. I think my knowledge of serial killer history is not anything, because I don't find it interesting. So this follows Pamela, who is the president of a sorority in Tallahassee at the University in Florida, on the night that they have an intruder in the house, and one of their friends, like sorority sisters, is murdered and others sustain injuries. And then it flashes forward to present day as she's still trying to process a lot of what happened and understand the history of crimes against women, I guess, and serial killers. So that's Pamela, but then you also have Tina, who also loses a friend in a completely different murder. But Tina sort of seeks out Pamela after the sorority sister murders become front page news, because Tina believes that this is a serial killer, not just individual men murdering individual women. And so Tina's sort of like a rogue DIY detective trying to piece together different things and also create a timeline for the police. A lot of this book is about how the institution of the police is, deeply corrupt and doesn't take crimes against women seriously because of, entrenched misogyny and the belief that violence against women is always to be blamed on women. And particularly in the 1970s setting, it really does bring to the forefront some of those questions about silly sorority sisters and how those stereotypes, deeply harm and are fatal for people. Like I say, the audiobook was really good. I think it's quite convoluted, the connections between all these different characters. That does feel a bit overwhelming at times on audio. And I think Jessica Knoll wrote this book in an attempt to question or create conversation around true crime obsession, consuming content around this. And I think she does do a good job in painting the murderer. He doesn't get much page time, and when he does, he's very much illustrated as a pathetic, piece of shit, basically, instead of commodifying or romanticizing or any of that weird shit that happens when people talk about some areas of true crime. But I wouldn't say the book in and of itself felt like a rebuttal or commentary. I feel like Jessica Knoll thought just by writing this book, that in itself was enough to get people to inspect their views about true crime, which I don't really think this did. It did make me feel icky in a lot of places, and it's not a subject that I would really ever read about. I just saw this as a recommendation from someone online who suggested it was sort of a breath of fresh air in the true crime commentary space, but that element didn't really put it off for me. But I haven't read enough into Knowles's writing practice to know if that's what she was seeking out to do, or if that's just what different reviewers have taken from the book. So I'd love to hear if you've read that one, because it's got a 4.3 on Storygraph. It's quite well reviewed, but I wouldn't, if I had known more, I think, about the content, I wouldn't have picked it up, maybe. Then I did listen to an excellent audiobook, non-fiction wise. This is Deadweight, Essays on Hunger and Harm. This is really recently published. I love the cover. I think I put this in a radar video, or maybe I planned to and then it was a radar that I missed. But this, yeah, really recently came out, and this is all about a very modern and contemporary understanding of eating disorders, diet culture, and the way that the way we talk about food harms everyone. It has a very gender inclusive approach. It does talk a lot about like young girls and young women who are impacted by the disease. It has some really great insights into like Tumblr online culture and the way that that was interpreted by the media in the 2000s and the 2010s as a way that, with like pro-Anna communities online and forums, how the media took and ran with that to say that basically young girls were like joining online eating disorder cults and like they wanted to make themselves sick, and how that, instead of inspecting the way we use the internet and understanding why young women were having to go to online spaces to find community and help for their illness, or even understand the fact they had an illness, it was just a blame and shame game, which obviously we see time and time again with popular media and young women. So I really, really enjoyed that commentary. And then it had quite a few different sections about race and eating disorder, how people from marginalized backgrounds, whether that's Black women, women from different religious communities, or not just women, actually people from different religious backgrounds, or people from the global majority, are impacted by stereotypes around eating disorders being attached to like young, thin, middle-class white women. And I really liked all of that commentary, particularly also about the prevalence of different types of eating disorders, talking about BED and in an American context, about the way that insurance companies impact the health and success rate of people recovering from eating disorders because of the strict limitations around inpatient care and all these different hoops you have to jump through, weight restrict, like that you have to be at a certain weight in order to get help, and how that fuels people's eating disorders instead of helps them seek support. And then it also talked about gender non-conforming people and patients of eating disorders who have experiences with inpatient, or who are advocates and raising awareness online. I just thought this was a really sort of well-rounded collection of thoughts and essays. Talks about like people that the author has known personally, pop culture icons who've spoken about disordered eating, the history of eating disorders, and like I say, all those different topics, but none of those felt tangential to me, at least. I felt like she really managed to give a deep as well as wide commentary on these topics. Definitely the best book, most inclusive and insightful book I've read on this topic in a really long time. So that's Deadweight. Obviously comes with a trigger warning that if you feel like a book like this would be difficult for you to read, then obviously take care of yourself first. But I definitely learned a lot and triggered a lot of positive thoughts in me about healthcare systems. And it has a really interesting section actually also on assisted dying and how that connects to people with like treatment resistant EDs. And yeah, I disagreed with a lot of the conclusions of some of the experts, but it did make me think a lot about that process as well. So that is Deadweight. Okay, then I read on my Kobo Whoever You Are, Honey by Olivia Gatwood. This came out really recently. I think I read it by NetGalley. This is an interesting setup. So it follows two different couples, or they're not really couples, two different sets of people living side by side on a beachfront outside of San Francisco. Lena and Sebastian. Sebastian's like a tech bro. He's made a lot of money. Lena doesn't really do anything, or we don't really know much about her. She doesn't really leave the house. And then you have Mitty and Bethel, who are Mitty is like in her 30s, and Bethel is in her 70s, and Bethel was a family friend of Mitty's mum. And Mitty's mum dropped her off at Bethel's house like 20 years ago because of an incident that happened with Mitty as a teenager, that she had to sort of leave. Well, she felt like she had to leave town. I loved Mitty and Bethel as a character duo. They were so funny. They live in this like kind of ramshackle, maximalistically decorated, full of tat and knickknacks type house that's falling apart, cigarette stained walls and sort of old rickety furniture that felt like so warm and homely. And they strike up a relationship with Lena because Lena moves in next door basically, and they start chatting and stuff, and Sebastian's very sort of detached. And then there is an incident, like a tragedy that occurs in the tech community that impacts Sebastian and Lena, and the news sort of starts spreading around the neighborhood. And so Mitty and Bethel want in on that conversation as well. I think it says it does, like basically AI is at the root of this book. And I think for me, like, I don't love dystopian that deals with AI, with like robots and that kind of tech at the best of times. And I think I saw this plot line coming a mile off, and then when it was the big reveal for it, I was kind of like, oh, whatever, like that's really annoying, because these characters felt so sort of like tangible and relatable. And then I felt like Olivia Gatwood was like, I don't know how to end this book, and just blow it all up. So yeah, I was really disappointed in this one in the end. I think particularly because the first like 50% I really quite liked, and I feel like it could have been taken in so many different directions. It didn't have to be that like get out of jail tech card. I would love to know if anyone also read this as a proof or anything, because it was frustrating, I think, but maybe I should have known going in that I wouldn't have loved the AI angle of it all. I read Bad Fruit by Ella King. I spoke about this in my catch-up video. I mentioned that I was listening to it on audio again, and that I was having a hard time because it was so dysfunctional. So this follows 3 siblings and their parents living in like a pretty normal life in London near Blackheath. But their mother, May, is that the mum's name? Kept getting mixed up between the mum and the daughter on audio. Yeah, it's May and Lily. Lily is the 18-year-old daughter. She's the youngest, and then she has an older brother and an older sister. And their mum, May, and Lily and May are really close. I would describe it from an armchair psychology point of view as like deeply enmeshed in a very toxic mother-daughter relationship, I think. So we open with Lily and May. Lily is the peacemaker of the family. She is always trying to keep everyone on an even keel, and we find out quite quickly that May is distraught because she finds out that her husband has been sending poetry to his daughter-in-law, like his son's ex-wife. And yeah, it starts with this sort of like explosive family argument, and we slowly start to see May, the mother, her dysfunction, her violence towards the children, her sort of complicated mood swings, and the way that she is the weather barometer for the family. Like if something's going wrong in her life, then everyone is impacted by it. And Lily is so deeply sort of desiring to please her mother and be the perfect daughter, but as she grows to 18, she's finishing school, she's got a place at Oxford, she knows deep down in her heart that she needs to get out, just like her siblings did. And her siblings are still part of the family, but they feel very differently towards her mother and almost resent Lily because she is seen as mama's girl, like as the favourite, even though she obviously experiences so much turmoil in that position too. And then we see Lily try and grow away from her mother and sort of build relationships outside of the family. She meets an older guy in a non sort of sexualized or romantic manner, which I really appreciated that was part of the storyline, that it wasn't like us watching Lily go off the deep end, who tries to show her that sort of the nuances of family life and the complicated relationships, but there is this opportunity to build. They meet doing like a volunteering gardening project, and Lily sort of goes there as her safe space. But I just want to say the violence against these adult children, emotional abuse, physical abuse, is so deeply difficult. I think something about listening to violence on audio I find even more visceral, because it's so I don't know, you can't really skim past it in a way. Like I was speeding up some bits, but it is much more difficult than reading it. I find it hard to recommend this book just because of how tragic and just how much violence and abusive family there was on the page. I looked into the author afterwards, and she's like a corporate lawyer who like specializes in anti-human trafficking and also in abuse, and I think you can really tell there's some sort of deeper knowledge there in the way these characters are constructed, so I thought that was interesting. Lily's mum May is, I believe, Malaysian, and she is very sort of deceptive about her family history and about her past, and Lily starts to experience these memories of her sort of back in Singapore, and she's unsure of the memories that like her when she went back to visit with her mum, or if they're her mum's own memories. And I think that was King's way of describing May's backstory and her family history, and to illustrate the way that sort of hurt begets hurt and trauma makes more trauma. And some of that is so aggressively violent as well, trigger warning for sexual abuse for sure. But I don't know if I loved that formatting of like the dreams and these like episodes that Lily had. I think I would have much preferred like just like a straight Jules timeline. So I wouldn't say like the narrative style worked for me entirely. That bit felt quite overwritten, I guess, to use that format. But the story itself is so well done, and I think the visceral reaction I had to some of those scenes is testament to the writing and to the characterization, because the narcissistic sort of constant abuse and emotional abuse that these young people experience at the hands of their mother is so heart-wrenching to read. So it's a hard one to recommend, I guess, but it was a visceral reading experience, I would say. And then I have one more audiobook I listened to, which is Queen Bee by Juno Dawson. This is like 0.5 in her trilogy, so she has how many others have there been? Let me check. I think we've had 2 in the Her Majesty's Royal Coven series, which is her like queer feminist witches living in the coven, fighting the warlocks, trying to make life in the real world work for them, which is a series I really love and I've spoken about, I think, a few times. And this is the prequel, so this is set in the era of Henry VIII, and it follows Queen Bee, aka Anne Boleyn, and her ladies in waiting, who are essentially her coven. So it's during the time of witches being undercover and marginalized, and it has a queer love story at its core. It's a very short book. It's like more like a novella, I guess. I hadn't seen it in person until I saw a picture on Juno Dawson's Instagram, but I listened to an audio. I think it's only like 5 hours. I did really enjoy this. I love to be back in the world, and I love to have Nicolette Coughlin in my ears narrating it. It's like the best part of these books is the audiobooks are narrated by her. And I really liked the like tenderness of the queer love story for Anne. I would say my history knowledge is very lacking in that area, despite teaching it and being taught it, I think, more than many other, more important, some may say, historical topics that aren't covered in schools. I did feel a bit hazy on like the, I know the rhyme, but I couldn't remember which Jane would have been part of the court at the same time, and I had to do a little bit of reading, but it did all like come together for me, and it's sort of set pre the witch hunt starting, and then as the witches are realizing that there's going to be like mass raids and sort of having to go into hiding and things like that. So yeah, it's really great. I feel like you could definitely read this as a standalone, particularly if you are a historical person and you're interested in that. And I really love a rewriting, like a queering of history. I find that really enjoyable. So if that's also your kind of thing, then you probably would enjoy this one. But I can wholeheartedly recommend the series in general, because it's great and I love it. I feel a bit heartbroken I have to wait so long for the next one now, but whatever. Then I just have 2 physical books to talk to you about. Just gonna get them. No, I actually have 3, sorry. The first one is White on White. Actually, let me start with the one that I read first, because it comments on these as well. This is the Alternatives. This is I spoke about this, I think, also when I had just got it. This is, I would consider this a family saga, I guess. It follows 4 Irish sisters, all living disparate dysfunctional lives. They were orphaned in their teens, they lost their parents in what they believed was a tragic accident, but more comes to light on that later. And they're all sort of surviving in their own ways through their own versions of success and I guess hustle culture. All 4 of them have PhDs, which is kind of like the hook of the book. Although one of them is a sort of Instagram chef and has got an honorary doctorate, and the other 3, one studies philosophy, one studies geology, and one studies like politics and citizens' assemblies. And one of them decides to take a hike, to sort of give up on her life quite quickly. So her name's Olwen. I was just checking, it says in the back. Olwen decides to disappear, and therefore the other women come back from London and one's in America to try and find their sister, despite the fact she told them she's fine and she doesn't want to be found. So we have this sort of goose chase at the core of the plot propelling us forward, but in between that is these long pieces of dialogue and conversation between the sisters who are trying to reckon with their relationship. They are very estranged in a lot of ways. They see each other, you know, especially the ones who live abroad, you know, once every couple of years, and are, because of the sort of trauma bond I guess they have as young when they lost their parents, they all feel very, especially the oldest sister, she feels very responsible and thinks that basically her way of doing life is the best way and people need to get on board. But she at her core also has a lot of complicated feelings and isn't maybe as picture perfect, or doesn't have a hold on her life in the way that other people think she might do. She decided to have a baby, like keep a baby from a one-night stand, although her sisters will think that she like went down the like medical professional, like I want to have a baby on my own through IVF and sperm donation kind of route, even though that wasn't it. So that's kind of like what I mean about the mirroring, and the things aren't always what they seem. But as we meet these sisters and their relationships, we start to understand the way that their professional endeavours impact their life view, or perhaps it is the other way around, their life view impacts their professional endeavours. So we have these long conversations about philosophy, about politics, about the rights of women, in quite a... It's this thing of like, I don't know if you've ever read or seen or felt this about yourself, but my therapist always says this to me, that I'm really good at intellectualizing my problems. Like I can feel my problems up here, but I can't feel them in here. And that is like the core of this book, is all these women feel their problems up here, but they cannot feel them in their heart and in their bodies especially. One of the sisters is experiencing like a series of quite unnerving physical symptoms that they're not sure about, like neuropathy, and she's living in America, she doesn't have health insurance, she's like a non-tenure, like an adjunct professor, and really struggling to manage her health, but doesn't want to come back to Ireland. And I really liked the conversations in here about health, the way her sisters were trying to help, and the lack of answers she's struggling with, and the imaginative and inventive ways she's managing to keep going, even though, you know, my heart was breaking for her and I just wanted to tell her to like sit down and rest. I think it was a realistic portrait of those early days of acquired disability and pushing through. So I'm finding it hard to articulate how much I loved this book, which I always struggle with that way more than I can. It's easier to criticize a book, I think, than to sing its praises. But I just absolutely adored this. I loved the family connections. I loved the sister dynamics and the wide-ranging conversations they had, and the offbeat disappearance that turned into this almost like sisterly reunion in the backwaters of a tiny Irish village. So yeah, there was a lot about this to love, a lot of side characters that felt really well fleshed out, you know, a friend of the adjunct professor, a neighbour of the oldest sister who uses his like weird GPS tracking system to find out where the missing sister is. And there was just all these tiny morsels of delicious writing that came together to make me fall in love with this book. So it's really hard to articulate why I loved the Flattery sisters so much, but this book brought me a lot of joy. I think particularly as like the first physical book I've read in ages, and the first book I felt like I had the brain power to actually get through. So I was so swept up in this story, and that feeling where anytime you're doing something else, what you want to be doing is reading. So I thank that book for that feeling for sure. So I most definitely had a big book hangover after that. So I wasn't sure what to read next, but I know I wanted a floppy paperback because I'd just been holding such a heavy book for a week. So I read White on White. This like master's or PhD student who moves to an unnamed European city to study like physical form in medieval architecture, Catholicism, churches, that kind of shtick. And she rents an apartment from Agnes, who is the wife of a professor who is in the same field as the student. But the apartment's sort of like a duplex with a main area, like a main apartment, and then like an extra space upstairs, which Agnes uses as a studio because she's an artist. And they actually live like further out in the countryside, but she comes in for work sometimes. So Agnes and the students strike up this strange, I wouldn't even call it a friendship, like just this strange relationship, getting to know each other. Agnes is deeply lonely, I think, and searching for connection but struggling to do so. She's fascinated by the youth of the student and the idea that the student has her whole life ahead of her, but she's very much masquerading as, again, as someone with their stuff together who doesn't have their stuff together. So as they become closer friends, I guess, and closer proximity to one another, Agnes stops sort of going home, and the student finds out she's actually been sleeping in the artist place upstairs, and we start to get the back history about her marriage and her relationship and her adult children, and how all of those things have brought her to stay in the city for longer, and how that loneliness has really crept up on her. It's a lot about age, I think, in this book, about aging, about youthfulness, about loneliness in midlife, about putting all your eggs in one basket when you get married, and having all your friendships revolve around you and your partner instead of you as a person. And there was some interesting commentary in here about art. If you're not a person who likes to read about visual art in books, I wouldn't say it's like overly so, but we do get some passages, particularly about the students' experience of visiting these various cathedrals and places where the statues are that she's looking at. But yeah, it was an odd, like an offbeat, odd, pretty plotless kind of literary story. I did enjoy it. I didn't love it. I know lots of people really loved this book, but I think perhaps it's because I read the alternative so close before that I was feeling a little hungover, shall we say. Okay, and the final book I have to talk to you about is Untold Lessons by Magdalena Valigo Tannet. This is a proof sent by Pushkin. It's published in September. This is translated from the Italian. It's set in the 1970s in a small village, and it follows the disappearance of a teacher after the suicide of a young girl in the school. It's a very close-knit community, a lot of gossip, a lot of intertwined familial connection. Someone's cousin lives next to the sister, and someone's friend's brother is this person. Like, it's a very small, insular community with a lot of historical textile practices. So there's like a big factory, and there's a lot of talk about industry and the changing landscape of work for these small rural parts of Italy. I wouldn't say this was like a thriller. It's definitely suspenseful in places, but we follow the teacher's disappearance and quite quickly figure out the situation. But it's almost one of those ones where you get that and then you take the steps back to work out how we got there, I guess. So I would say that don't go into it thinking it's going to be like a huge romp, wild goose chase looking for someone. It doesn't really have that propulsion behind it, I would say. I did enjoy this. Again, I think I'm still suffering from how much I love the alternatives. For me, sometimes I don't think Italian translations work super well. I find them often a little stilted, in the same way that sometimes I find Japanese literature a little stilted for me as the reader. Like, obviously that's not cultural commentary, that's just talking about the translation aspect of the storytelling. like the sentence by sentence structure I can sometimes feel at arm's length, which sometimes I enjoy. In this case I didn't. I wanted this to be a bit richer, a bit more emotive, a bit more, like, have a bit more grit and grain to the writing. I didn't necessarily feel super connected to these characters or empathize with the collective grief of the village. I struggled to get on board with that, I think, which is, yeah, could be a me thing, could be a writing thing, but it's definitely an easy to read book. It's one that you could breeze through in a couple of days. But yeah, was like pretty mid for me, I guess I would say. So with that, that is the final book I read in July, and let me know if you had a better or worse reading month than this, what you are planning on picking up. Please talk to me if you've read the alternatives. I really need more people to talk to it with, so let me know, and I'll see you again for the next one. Bye.